The old veteran was serving food in the mess hall until the Admiral recognized his tattoo and froze. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The mess hall was buzzing with the usual lunchtime chatter. Soldiers, airmen, and Marines all filed in, lined up for their food. The hum of conversation and trays clattering against the stainless steel counters filled the air. Among them, an old man quietly worked behind the counter, dishing out mashed potatoes and vegetables to the men and women in uniform. His hands, weathered by years of hard work, moved with slow precision as he served each meal. He was a fixture here, a quiet presence who seemed to belong to the background of the base's daily rhythm. To the young soldiers, he was just another old man, a relic of a bygone era, doing his part without a word of complaint. But to them, he was nothing special. He had no rank on his uniform, no medals to show off, and no ceremonial ribbons draped across his chest. He simply wore an old apron and served food. As the line moved forward, a young airman, fresh from basic training and eager to impress his comrades, stepped up to the counter. With a smug grin, he leaned in and asked, "So, what's your rank, Grandpa? Or are you just here to make sure the mashed potatoes are up to code?" The old man didn't respond right away, his tired eyes flickering with a hint of recognition before returning to his work. The airman waited for a moment, expecting a reply, but there was only the sound of the old man's slow movements and the clatter of utensils. "Come on, Grandpa." The airman pressed, his voice laced with mockery. "You in charge of the chow hall or something?" Still, the old man said nothing. He simply handed over the next tray of food to the next soldier in line. The airman snorted, turning to his buddies behind him and muttering, "Guess he doesn't have a rank, huh? Just a guy trying to relive his glory days." A few chuckles rang out among the younger soldiers, the kind of laughter that came easy to those who had never seen the horrors of war, the kind of laughter that came from youthful ignorance. The old man's hands paused for a brief moment, but he said nothing. His gaze, however, shifted for a split second to the airman's chest. It was then that the airman noticed something, a small, faded tattoo peeking from under the old man's sleeve. It was the kind of tattoo that wasn't flashy or decorated with bright colors, but one that carried a deeper meaning, one that had clearly weathered years of experience. The airman's expression shifted slightly, but he was quick to mask it with another joke. "What's that, huh? Some kind of old-school tattoo from the 60s. The old man slowly rolled up his sleeve, revealing the full extent of the tattoo, a simple, yet unmistakable symbol of a unit that had long since been disbanded, a unit that few in the military ever spoke of. It was the kind of tattoo that sent a chill down anyone's spine who knew its true meaning. But before the airman could process it, a voice from behind the counter cut through the air. "What's going on here?" The voice was firm, commanding, and unmistakable. The airman turned, startled to see a figure standing in the doorway of the mess hall. It was a man dressed in the immaculate uniform of a high-ranking officer, his shoulders adorned with the silver stars of a four-star general. His eyes were fixed on the old man, and for a moment, everything in the room seemed to freeze. The general's gaze didn't shift from the tattoo. His voice, when it came, was low and filled with reverence. Is that the symbol of the Ghost Squadron?" The airman's face turned pale. The Ghost Squadron. The name carried with it a weight, a legacy of legends and battles fought in the shadows, a group of soldiers whose stories were whispered about, but rarely ever confirmed. The old man simply nodded. And in that moment, the atmosphere in the mess hall shifted. The laughter stopped. The clattering of trays ceased. Every soldier in the room stood still, their eyes on the general and the old man. The general walked forward, the room parting in reverence as he moved past the airman and approached the counter. He stopped in front of the old man, standing tall and silent for a moment before he saluted. It wasn't just a formal salute. It was the kind of salute given to a legend, to a man whose name had been forgotten by most, but whose deeds had never truly been erased. "Sergeant Major," the general said, his voice filled with awe and respect. It is an honor to stand in your presence." The airman stood frozen, his face turning from confusion to shame as he realized the gravity of his mistake. The general turned to him, his eyes sharp and commanding. "You will address this man with the respect he deserves, or you will not set foot on this base again." "Understood." The airman stammered an apology, but the general's gaze didn't waver. The old man, now recognized for the hero he truly was, simply smiled softly, as if this moment of respect was nothing new to him. He had been underestimated his entire life, but he had always known the truth. And now, the room knew too. The room was silent, the hum of conversation and the clattering of trays now replaced by an eerie stillness. The general's salute still hung in the air, a powerful symbol of respect and recognition. The old man, Sergeant Major Martin Kelly, stood there, his worn hands still resting on the counter, but now he carried the weight of a lifetime of service and sacrifice in the room's collective gaze. His eyes, though tired, were clear, steady. He didn't need words to command respect. His presence alone did the job. The airman, who had mocked him moments before, now stood frozen, his face flushed with embarrassment. He had no idea who the old man was, no understanding of the man he had just disrespected. But now, in front of the general, he realized the gravity of his mistake. The general's eyes turned from Martin Kelly to the young airman. "You." The general's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You will apologize to this man, and you will do it with the respect he's earned. Is that understood?" The airman's voice was barely a whisper, his pride crushed beneath the weight of his error. "Yes, sir." The general turned to Martin Kelly. Then, his demeanor softening slightly. "Sergeant Major, I don't think I've had the honor of hearing your name spoken in too many years. I should have known better," he said quietly, his voice now carrying a touch of remorse. Martin Kelly nodded, his lips curling slightly into a smile, but there was no bitterness, just an understanding. "It's all right, General," he said softly. "I've spent most of my life in the background. A lot of us did, but we were always there." The general nodded again, his respect growing with every word. "You don't know the half of it, sir. I can only imagine the things you've seen, the battles you fought in. Some of us were fortunate enough to hear stories, but most of them never made it to the history books." The general glanced at the rest of the soldiers in the room, who were all still standing motionless, watching the exchange unfold before them. There was no laughter now, no mocking, just a deep, reverent silence. The general's gaze swept across the mess hall, and he raised his voice, addressing the soldiers. "This man, this soldier, is the reason we're all here today. Without men like him, there would be no base, no freedom, no United States military. You owe him more than just an apology. You owe him your respect." The room, filled with men and women who had trained for years, who had fought in wars, now felt small and humble under the weight of those words. They had all been so quick to judge, to laugh at the old man. But now, they saw him for what he truly was, a living legend. Martin Kelly had been a part of a special unit during his time in the service, a unit whose history was only whispered about in the shadows. The Ghost Squadron, a team that had operated in the most dangerous and covert missions, often under impossible circumstances. But the world outside those missions had long since forgotten them. As the years passed, the old soldiers faded into the background, just like the old uniforms they once wore. But in this mess hall, on this day, Sergeant Major Kelly was no longer just a forgotten figure. The general turned back to Martin Kelly, a smile breaking through his stern expression. "I should have known better, Sergeant Major. There are things I'm sure even I don't know about your time in the service. I'd be honored to hear your story, if you're willing to share." Martin Kelly's eyes flickered with something between sorrow and gratitude. He didn't want recognition, he never had. But in the presence of the general, surrounded by men who had made the same sacrifices, he felt the weight of his past lift, even if just for a moment. "Maybe some other time, General," he said, his voice low, the years of war and memory settling into his words. "But for now, I think these young men and women have had enough of my stories for one day." The general's eyes softened. "Understood, Sergeant Major." As Martin Kelly turned to continue his work, the airman who had once mocked him stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice sincere now. "I didn't know who you were. I had no right." Martin Kelly looked at the young man, his expression unreadable. For a moment, It seemed as though he might turn away, but instead, he gave a slight nod, accepting the apology without words. The young airman stood there, still, as if in awe of the man in front of him. No one spoke as the general and his officers walked out of the mess hall, leaving the soldiers in their wake to reflect on the true meaning of respect. In that moment, the old veteran had been more than just a man serving food. He had been a reminder of everything they had sworn to protect, a living piece of history who had never needed to prove himself again. The mess hall had returned to its normal pace, but the atmosphere was undeniably different. The chatter was quieter now, the usual teasing and banter replaced with respectful nods and whispers. The young airman, who had once mocked Martin Kelly, stood with his tray in hand, still processing the moment that had just unfolded. His friends, who had been laughing along with him just moments before, were now uncomfortably silent. They hadn't known. None of them had known the history behind the old man who had served them lunch. The airman, his face flushed with embarrassment, couldn't help but glance over at Martin, who was back at his post, silently serving the next soldier in line. The general's words still echoed in his ears, words that carried an authority he had never before truly understood. You owe him your respect. Those words had been a wake-up call, a realization that there was more to service than just rank and ceremony. Martin Kelly was not just a man who had lived through war. He was a legend, a living testament to the sacrifices made by so many others. The young airman had thought he was just a simple civilian, someone who had been left behind, forgotten by time. But now, after seeing the respect from the general and hearing the whispers from the other soldiers, he knew better. Martin Kelly was no ordinary man. He had been part of something much bigger than anyone had ever realized. The day wore on, and the mess hall began to empty out as the soldiers returned to their posts. But Martin Kelly remained in his spot, dishing out food, just as he had done for countless years. No one dared approach him now. They didn't need to. There was an unspoken understanding between them all. As the sun began to set, the mess hall was nearly empty, save for a few soldiers who lingered over their meals, too lost in thought to leave. The young airman walked over to Martin's station, his steps hesitant but determined. He had to do something, anything, to make up for the disrespect he had shown. "Sir," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Martin Kelly looked up, his tired eyes meeting the young airman's. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then, the airman spoke again. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were, and I should have respected you from the start." Martin Kelly's gaze softened, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's all right, son," he said quietly. "You didn't know, and now you do." The airman stood there, unsure of what to say next. But before he could speak again, Martin added, "We all make mistakes. The important thing is what we do after. You learned something today. That's what matters." The airman nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of guilt and admiration. He had learned something, but it was more than just the old man's past. It was the lesson of respect, of understanding that everyone had their own story, their own struggles, and their own sacrifices. He had been quick to judge, but now he saw things differently. Martin Kelly turned his attention back to his work, his hands moving with practiced ease. The airman stood for a moment longer, taking in the scene around him. The mess hall, once a place of jokes and mockery, now felt like a place of quiet reverence. The soldiers who had passed through it that day had seen something they hadn't expected. They had seen a man who had lived through the worst of it all, a man who had seen friends fall beside him and had kept fighting anyway. He wasn't a hero in the way that the movies portrayed. There were no grand speeches, no battles won in the blink of an eye. But his life had been one of quiet service, one of doing his duty no matter the cost. And that, in itself, was the most heroic thing of all. As the last of the soldiers filed out, the young airman lingered for a moment, then made his way to the door. He looked back one last time at Martin Kelly, who was still standing behind the counter, still serving food, just as he had done for years. But now, the airman understood. He wasn't just serving food. He was serving a legacy that would never be forgotten, not now, not ever. As the days went by, the events of the past afternoon seemed to weigh on everyone who had been present in the mess hall. The story of the old man with the faded tattoo spread like wildfire across the base, not in the form of gossip, but as a story of respect, one that made every soldier, airman, and Marine pause and think about what they truly valued in life. The young airman who had once mocked Martin Kelly found himself constantly replaying the encounter in his mind, his actions before the general's arrival now a source of deep shame. He had thought he was just joking, just having fun like any other young recruit. But now, he understood how wrong he had been. He didn't speak much about the old man to his fellow soldiers. Instead, he kept his distance, reflecting on what he had learned. For the first time in his life, he understood that respect didn't come from rank or titles, but from the sacrifices made and the strength shown through hardship. The general's words echoed in his mind. You owe him your respect. Meanwhile, Martin Kelly continued his duties at the mess hall, the quiet and steady rhythm of his work unchanged. He had been through enough battles to know that recognition didn't come easily. But something had shifted. The soldiers, now aware of who he was, watched him with a newfound reverence. The general's visit had altered the course of that day, but it had also planted a seed of respect that would continue to grow. A few days later, when the base's commanding officer called for a meeting to discuss the old unit's history, there was a noticeable shift in the tone of the conversation. The topic of the Ghost Squadron had been avoided for decades, its stories buried under layers of secrecy and time. But now, the room was filled with a sense of honor. The general had made sure that Martin Kelly's story would be shared, that the legacy of the men and women who had served in the most dangerous corners of the world would not be forgotten. The meeting was filled with moments of silence as the soldiers listened to accounts of those who had served with Martin Kelly, the battles they fought together, and the lives they saved. It was clear that this wasn't just a story about one man. It was about all the men who had stood beside him in the darkest of times. And it was a reminder that those who had served, who had given so much, were not to be forgotten. As the meeting drew to a close, the commanding officer looked around the room. There are stories out there, he said, his voice steady and respectful. Stories of courage, of sacrifice, of honor. These are the stories that define us. And we will make sure that no matter how many years pass, they will never be forgotten. Back in the mess hall, Martin Kelly still served the meals, but now there was a quiet respect in the way soldiers spoke to him, in the way they looked at him. He had not asked for this recognition, but he knew it was finally time for the truth to be known. One afternoon, as the sun began to set and the last few soldiers finished their meals, the young airman who had once mocked him approached Martin again. This time there was no smug grin, no jokes, just a simple, genuine respect. Sir, he said, his voice sincere, I've been thinking about what you said, about learning something today. I just wanted to say, thank you, for everything. Martin Kelly looked at him for a moment, then nodded. You're welcome, son, he replied. We all have lessons to learn. Some of us just take longer to see them. The airman stood still for a moment, then turned and walked out of the mess hall. The base was quiet as evening fell, but there was a sense of unity in the air, a sense of pride that hadn't been there before. Martin Kelly may have been an old man serving food, but to those who now understood, he was far more than that. He was a living legend, a reminder of what it truly meant to serve with honor, to fight with everything you had, and to never let the world forget the sacrifices made. As weeks passed, the base seemed to shift in an unspoken way. The respect that had been born from the mess hall encounter spread, slowly but surely, into every corner of the base. Soldiers walked a little taller, officers held their heads a little higher. It was as if the very air was charged with something different, something deeper than routine. The story of Sergeant Major Martin Kelly had become a touchstone, a living legacy that reminded everyone who served that honor was earned, not given. For Martin, nothing had really changed in his day-to-day life. He still served meals in the mess hall, still worked quietly behind the counter, his hands worn with years of service. But now, when soldiers entered the room, they paused. They didn't just file in and grab their food without a second thought. No, now they noticed. They saw him. They knew who he was. The general's visit had been a catalyst, a spark that lit a fire of respect for the old veteran, and that fire was spreading. One afternoon, as Martin served his usual batch of mashed potatoes to a new group of soldiers, he was approached by a young man, a lieutenant fresh out of officer training. The lieutenant hesitated for a moment before stepping up to the counter. There was no mockery in his eyes, no smug grin, just a quiet respect, the kind of respect Martin had earned. Over a lifetime of service. Sergeant Major, the lieutenant said, his voice steady but with a hint of awe. I've heard your story. I wanted to thank you for your service. You've inspired all of us." Martin Kelly looked up from his work, his tired eyes meeting the lieutenant's. He didn't say anything at first, just gave a slight nod. The lieutenant continued, his voice now softer. "I'm honored to be serving with men like you. I hope one day I can live up to the legacy you've left behind." Martin Kelly gave him a small smile, a brief flash of warmth, before turning back to his work. "We all do what we can, son," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "We all do what we can." As the lieutenant walked away, he glanced over his shoulder at Martin Kelly, standing there behind the counter, the same old man who had been quietly serving meals for decades. But now, in that brief exchange, the lieutenant had seen something more. He had seen a man who was more than just a veteran. He was a symbol of everything the military stood for: sacrifice, honor, duty. Martin Kelly's story was no longer one of just personal battles fought in the shadows. It was a story that connected every soldier on that base, a reminder of why they wore the uniform, a reminder of what they were willing to fight for. The story of the Ghost Squadron, once whispered only in the darkest corners of the military, was now a part of the fabric of the base's culture. It was taught in briefings, passed down from one soldier to the next, not as some distant myth, but as a living truth. The men of the Ghost Squadron were no longer forgotten. They had been brought back into the light, and their legacy would be carried forward, forever woven into the history of the base. But it wasn't just the soldiers who were affected by Martin's presence. Word of the old veteran's story spread to the families who lived on the base as well. The wives, the children, even the civilians who worked in the commissary or the base's administrative offices. Everyone began to understand the man behind the uniform. One Saturday, during a community event, Martin Kelly was invited to speak. He had never been one for speeches, never one to stand in the spotlight. But this time, it was different. As he stood in front of a small crowd, his hands trembling slightly, he began to speak. "I never wanted fame," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I never wanted recognition. I just did what needed to be done. I did it for my brothers and sisters who were out there with me, the ones who didn't make it back. That's all we ever wanted, just to make sure the ones we loved came home." His words were simple, but they resonated deeply with everyone who heard them. The room fell silent as Martin continued, telling stories of his time in the service, of the men and women who had fought beside him, of the battles they had faced. His voice cracked with emotion as he spoke of the friends he had lost, the ones who would never be remembered except in the hearts of those who had served with them. "We don't do it for the glory," he finished, his voice strong again. "We do it because it's the right thing to do. And sometimes, that's enough." The room was still for a moment longer, and then, almost as if on cue, a round of applause erupted. It wasn't the applause of a crowd cheering a hero. It was the applause of a community acknowledging the sacrifice of one of its own. It was the applause of respect, and it echoed through the hearts of everyone who had gathered there that day. As Martin Kelly left the stage, the applause continued, and the young airman who had once mocked him stood up, his hands shaking with emotion as he joined in. In that moment, the old veteran was more than just a man with a past. He was a symbol of everything the military stood for, a reminder that true heroism was found in the quietest of actions, the smallest of gestures. And as the applause echoed through the hall, Martin Kelly finally felt that, after all these years, his story had been heard. Not just by the soldiers, but by everyone who needed to hear it. The recognition that had followed Martin Kelly's story didn't stop at the base. It spread far beyond the walls of the mess hall, seeping into the community and into the hearts of people who had never known the true cost of freedom. Every time someone walked into the base, there was a sense of reverence. The whispers about Martin Kelly grew louder, and while some still didn't fully understand the weight of his past, there was no mistaking the respect that followed him. Yet for Martin, it wasn't the recognition that mattered. What mattered was that those around him understood the deeper lesson he had carried with him for all those years. It wasn't about medals or accolades. It was about quietly doing the job, about honoring those who had sacrificed beside him. A month passed after the community event, and life on base had largely returned to normal, albeit with a new sense of purpose. But then came a message, one that would again change the trajectory of Martin's life. It came in the form of a letter, sealed with the unmistakable insignia of a high-ranking officer. As he read the letter in the quiet of his room, his hands shook slightly. It was an invitation, one that he never thought he would receive. The letter was from the Department of Defense. They were offering him a chance to formally accept an honor for his service, an award for his actions during his time with the Ghost Squadron. The letter was respectful, acknowledging his contributions and offering him the kind of recognition that most soldiers only dreamed of. But Martin knew, in the deepest part of his heart, that the kind of recognition being offered wasn't what he wanted. He had turned down honors before. He had never been one for accolades. But this was different. This was a chance to stand in front of the men and women who served now. A chance to pass on the knowledge, the experiences, the lessons that had been passed on to him. It was a chance to make sure that the legacy of his brothers and sisters who had fought and died beside him was never forgotten. The decision weighed heavily on him. He had always been a man of few words, preferring action over ceremony. But the offer was too significant to ignore. It wasn't just for him. It was for the others who had never made it home, the ones who would never be recognized. It was for the ghosts of the past that had shaped the future. Martin Kelly responded to the invitation, accepting the honor. Not for himself, but for those who had served with him. The day arrived, a day Martin had never thought would come, and he found himself standing at the podium in front of an audience that included generals, politicians, and fellow soldiers. The room was filled with silent anticipation, all eyes on him. But Martin Kelly wasn't there to speak about himself. He wasn't there to boast about the things he had done or the battles he had fought. Instead, he spoke of those who had been left behind, the soldiers who had never made it back, whose stories would never be told. "I stand before you today not as a hero," Martin began, his voice steady and clear, "but as a representative of all those who have come before us. The ones whose names you won't find in any book, whose stories you won't find in the history channels, but whose sacrifices have built the foundation of what we stand on today." He paused, looking around the room. "We don't do this for recognition. We do it because it's what's right. We do it because it's our duty to those who can't be here to do it themselves." The room was quiet, but there was no mistaking the effect his words had. Even the most hardened officers, the ones who had seen it all, felt the weight of his words. Martin's speech wasn't long, but it was enough. He had said what needed to be said. He had honored the legacy of his brothers and sisters, and in doing so, he had given everyone in the room something to reflect on. It wasn't the medals or the awards that mattered. It was the honor, the duty, the silent commitment to something greater than oneself. When the ceremony ended, the applause was genuine. Not because of the man standing at the podium, but because of the story he represented. And as Martin Kelly made his way back to his seat, he noticed the soldiers looking at him. They weren't just looking at the old man with the tattoo anymore. They were looking at a living piece of history, a symbol of the ideals they had all sworn to uphold. For the first time in his life, Martin Kelly felt like the weight of his service, his sacrifice, was truly understood. And that, he knew, was the greatest honor of all. Months passed after the ceremony, and life at the base continued, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. The soldiers who had once seen Martin Kelly as just another old man behind the mess hall counter now saw him as something more. They had witnessed the quiet strength of his character, the humility that accompanied his sacrifices, and the immense legacy that had been hidden beneath years of anonymity. The base was never the same. It wasn't just the soldiers who felt the change. Even the civilian workers who interacted with Martin daily began to feel the weight of his story. The janitors who cleaned the halls, the clerks who managed the paperwork, the cooks who worked alongside him. They all started to look at him differently. No longer was he just the old man who served food. Now, he was a living testament to the sacrifices that built the foundation of their country, a reminder of everything they owed to those who came before. And yet, Martin remained unchanged. He didn't seek attention. He didn't ask for special treatment. He went about his days with the same quiet dignity, doing the work he had always done. But now, when soldiers entered the mess hall, they greeted him with respect, their voices a little quieter, their postures a little straighter. They saw him, not just as a veteran, but as a symbol of what it truly meant to serve. One day, Martin received a call. It was from an officer he hadn't heard from in years. General Thompson, the four-star general who had first recognized Martin's tattoo, was calling to ask for his help. It wasn't something Martin had expected, but he knew the moment the general spoke that this would be a call he could not refuse. Sergeant Major. General Thompson's voice came through the phone. We have a situation that I believe only you can help with. I need you to come to the command center. It's about the Ghost Squadron's legacy. Martin had spent years in silence, but he had never forgotten his brothers and sisters who had served in that unit. The Ghost Squadron had been a group of elite soldiers, operating in the shadows of history. Their missions were classified, their accomplishments almost erased from the official records. But now, General Thompson needed Martin to help preserve the legacy of those who had fought and died in the shadows. Without hesitation, Martin agreed. He arrived at the command center later that afternoon, his heart heavy with the weight of history. The general greeted him warmly, and together they sat in a quiet conference room, surrounded by maps and old files. The general wasted no time. We've discovered something, he said, his tone serious. A few of the records from the Ghost Squadron have been lost or misplaced over the years. But we've found a critical piece of information that could change everything. I need you to verify it. The files in front of them were faded, worn with time. But Martin recognized the name immediately. It was a name that had haunted him for years, a name that had been on the lips of every soldier in his unit. He traced his finger over the paper, his heart racing. This can't be real, he muttered under his breath. This mission should have been buried. General Thompson looked at him. That's why we need you, Sergeant Major, to confirm the truth. If this information is correct, it could rewrite the history of our military. The Ghost Squadron wasn't just a group of soldiers. They were part of something bigger, something more powerful than anyone ever realized. Martin nodded slowly. He knew exactly what the general was talking about. The Ghost Squadron had never been just another covert unit. They had been tasked with some of the most dangerous and secretive operations during the Cold War. And now, decades later, their story was about to be revealed to the world. Martin's hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the file, the weight of the past threatening to overwhelm him. What do you need from me? He asked quietly. I need you to tell the story, Sergeant Major. To speak about what happened during that mission. The world needs to know the truth. Your story, your experience, could change everything. It was a lot to ask of a man who had spent most of his life in the shadows. But Martin knew, deep down, that it was time. Time to honor the legacy of the Ghost Squadron. Time to ensure that their sacrifices would never be forgotten. Martin agreed to help, and together, they began to work on a project that would bring the Ghost Squadron story to light. It wasn't easy. There were obstacles, secrets that had been buried for years, and those who didn't want the truth to come out. But Martin was determined. The same determination that had gotten him through the toughest battles of his life carried him through this task. The project eventually led to a documentary that would air nationally, a special program about the Ghost Squadron and their missions, featuring interviews with Martin and the few surviving members of the unit. When it aired, the world saw the true story of the Ghost Squadron for the first time. They saw the bravery, the sacrifice, and the dedication of men who had been willing to give everything for their country, all without ever seeking recognition. The documentary was a success, but for Martin, it was more than just an achievement. It was the final chapter of a life spent in service, a way to ensure that the legacy of his brothers and sisters would live on forever. As the credits rolled on the screen, Martin sat alone in his room, watching. He didn't need the applause, the accolades, or the recognition. All he needed was the knowledge that the story had been told. And with that, he could finally rest easy. It had been a few months since the documentary aired, and life at the base had shifted once again. The recognition for Martin Kelly, though not something he sought, had become a symbol for the soldiers who followed in his footsteps. His story had been told, and with it, the legacy of the Ghost Squadron had been preserved for future generations. But for Martin, nothing had really changed. He continued his routine, still serving meals in the mess hall, still quietly honoring the ghosts of the past with every action. Yet, there was a new respect in the eyes of those who came to the mess hall. They no longer saw just the old man behind the counter. They saw the history he carried, the sacrifices he had made, and the stories that were far too often left untold. The base had become a place of reflection, a place where soldiers came to understand the weight of what they wore on their uniforms. In the weeks following the documentary, several veterans, some of whom had served alongside Martin, began visiting him. Some came to express their gratitude, others simply to reconnect, but all of them shared the same. reverence for the man who had quietly borne witness to so much. On one such occasion, a retired captain from the Ghost Squadron came to visit. He had been in the unit with Martin during some of their most dangerous missions. The captain, though no longer in active service, still carried the weight of those days with him. "I've heard your story," the captain said as he sat down across from Martin, his voice thick with emotion. "And it's about time. You've earned it, old friend." Martin smiled gently, the lines on his face deepening as he nodded. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it for the men who didn't come back. They're the ones who should be remembered." The captain's eyes softened. "But now it's your turn. You can't keep your head down forever. Your story is a part of our history now." They sat in silence for a moment, both men lost in their thoughts. Outside, the base was quiet, the usual sounds of drills and marching muted by the setting sun. The captain eventually spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I know you didn't want the attention, Martin, but the world needed to hear what we went through. They needed to hear about the Ghost Squadron." Martin nodded once more, his hands resting on the table in front of him. "We did what we had to do. No one asked us to be heroes. We just did our jobs. And that's why you're a hero," the captain said with a smile. "Because you never saw yourself as one. You just did what was right." The conversation shifted to old memories, stories from their time together during covert operations, tales of survival against impossible odds. As they reminisced, a group of younger soldiers entered the mess hall. They hesitated for a moment when they saw the captain and Martin sitting together, the atmosphere between them charged with respect. The captain noticed their glance and stood, giving them a nod. "Go ahead, don't stand around," he said, his voice carrying authority. "This is the man who helped win wars, gentlemen. You should be paying attention." The soldiers stood straighter, looking at Martin, their expressions shifting from curiosity to genuine respect. Martin didn't acknowledge them with words, but the way he met their gaze said everything. He wasn't a hero in their eyes because he had been told he was. He had earned it through years of silent sacrifice. As the soldiers took their seats, the captain clapped Martin on the back. "You've made an impact, my friend. More than you'll ever know." Martin smiled softly. "I just want them to understand. To know what we went through. For the ones who can't tell their stories themselves." As the evening wore on, Martin and the captain continued to share stories of their past. But with every passing hour, Martin felt a sense of closure he hadn't known he needed. His story had been heard, his legacy preserved, and now he could rest easy knowing that the men who had fought beside him would never be forgotten. When the captain left, the mess hall was quieter than usual, but it wasn't a silence born of sadness. It was a silence born of understanding. Soldiers ate their meals with a new sense of reverence, glancing occasionally at the old man behind the counter. For them, Martin Kelly wasn't just a veteran. They could see now that he was a symbol of what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to honor the past. Later that night, as Martin cleaned the counter and prepared to leave for the day, a young private approached him, nervously shifting from foot to foot. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you," the private said quietly. "For everything. You gave me a new understanding of what it really means to serve." Martin looked at the private, his face softening as he nodded. "You'll learn as you go," Martin said with a smile. "It's not about the awards or the medals. It's about the people you serve with. It's about what you leave behind when it's all over." The private nodded, and for the first time, he truly understood. As Martin left the mess hall that evening, he looked around at the base, his home for so many years. It wasn't just a place for soldiers. It was a place where stories lived on, a place where men like him could quietly make their mark on the world. And for Martin Kelly, that was enough. Weeks after the documentary aired and Martin Kelly's speech in front of the community, the base was abuzz with a sense of change that could not be ignored. The respect that had been steadily growing in the mess hall had now spread to every corner of the base. Young soldiers who once had no idea who Martin was, or even what he represented, now walked with more purpose. They understood, even if just a little, what it truly meant to wear the uniform. But while the soldiers around him grew and reflected on their own purpose, Martin Kelly continued his daily routine with the same quiet dignity. The base may have changed, but he remained the same. The men and women he served beside might have earned the medals, but it was he who had borne the weight of their sacrifices. He had lived through the worst of it, watched his friends fall beside him, and yet he remained. That was his strength. One late afternoon, As Martin finished up his usual rounds in the mess hall, an unfamiliar face walked in. The man was older than most, with the kind of presence that immediately caught your attention. His uniform, though worn, was impeccably neat. He moved with purpose and confidence, and when he approached the counter, Martin immediately sensed there was something different about him. "Sergeant Major Kelly?" the man asked, his voice firm but respectful. "Yes, that's me," Martin replied, his eyes narrowing slightly, sizing up the stranger. The man held out his hand. "I'm Colonel Harris. I've been tasked with organizing a special event, and I need you to be there. It's important." Martin didn't respond immediately. He wasn't one for ceremonies, not for the kinds of events that seemed to elevate people like him to the status of hero. But something in the colonel's tone told him this was different. "What kind of event?" Martin asked, still wary. "A memorial," Colonel Harris said, his eyes hardening slightly. "A memorial for the Ghost Squadron. We're planning to honor your unit's sacrifices, and we'd like you to be part of it." Martin felt a lump rise in his throat. The Ghost Squadron. It had been years since he had even heard the name spoken aloud. It was a name buried in secrecy, hidden by time, but always a part of him. He had lived through the missions, the horrors, the losses. And now, the squadron's story was about to be remembered, officially, in front of the world. It wasn't something Martin had ever wanted. But as the colonel spoke, he felt the weight of duty settle back onto his shoulders. "You don't have to do this," Colonel Harris continued, sensing Martin's hesitation. "But your story, Sergeant Major, it's time. It's time for the world to know who you are, who your unit was." Martin looked down at his hands, remembering the men who had served with him, men whose names were forgotten, whose families would never see them honored. He couldn't turn his back on them. "Not now." "I'll do it," Martin said, finally, his voice steady. "But it's not just about me. It's about them. The men who aren't here anymore." Colonel Harris nodded, grateful for the old man's acceptance. The two of them made arrangements for the memorial, and soon, the base was buzzing with the news. Soldiers, veterans, and families all began preparing for the event that would honor the Ghost Squadron. For Martin, the days leading up to the memorial were a blur of planning and emotions he hadn't anticipated. When the day finally arrived, he stood before the crowd, dressed in his old uniform, the one he hadn't worn in years. The crowd was a mix of familiar faces, soldiers who had heard the stories, families who had lost loved ones, and strangers, veterans from other units who had come to pay their respects. It was a somber atmosphere, filled with quiet anticipation. Martin stood tall as the ceremony began, but he wasn't thinking of himself. He was thinking of the men who had stood beside him in those dark, forgotten places. The ceremony unfolded with speeches and memories, each person offering their tribute to the bravery of the Ghost Squadron. When it was Martin's turn to speak, he stepped forward, his old body moving with the kind of strength only a lifetime of service could give him. "I wasn't looking for recognition," he began, his voice clear but low. "I never needed a medal, a plaque, or a ceremony. I was doing my job, same as everyone else. But this is for the ones who didn't come back. This is for them." The crowd was silent, waiting for him to continue. The Ghost Squadron wasn't about fame. It was about doing what had to be done when no one else could do it. We were a team. We had each other's backs. And that's all that mattered. Martin paused, taking a deep breath as his gaze swept across the crowd. "We didn't expect to be remembered. We didn't expect to be honored. But if my being here today helps anyone remember the sacrifices of my brothers and sisters, then that's enough for me." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with a sense of reverence for the man who had carried the weight of his fallen comrades' memories for so long. Slowly, one by one, the crowd rose to their feet, honoring Martin's words and the men who had served beside him. It wasn't the loud applause of victory. It was the quiet acknowledgement of a life spent in service, of a sacrifice made without fanfare or expectation. As the ceremony came to a close, Martin Kelly stood at the front of the crowd, not as a hero, but as a witness to history, a man who had lived through it all and had never forgotten what truly mattered: duty, sacrifice, and the bond that held soldiers together, even in the darkest of times. As the days following the memorial ceremony settled into a quiet calm, Martin Kelly continued his life at the base. The honor and recognition he had received were still fresh, but for him, it was just another chapter in a life filled with stories of camaraderie, sacrifice, and duty. He had never sought the spotlight, but now, it seemed that the world could finally see him for what he truly was. Not a hero in the traditional sense, but a soldier who had given everything for his country, and in doing so, had earned a place in the memories of those who understood what it meant to serve. The documentary had shown the world his story, but it was more than just his story. It was a tribute to the Ghost Squadron and the countless soldiers who had given their lives without ever asking for recognition. The legacy of those men and women would live on in the hearts of everyone who had heard their story. But even with all the attention and accolades, Martin knew that the real work was still to be done. There were still soldiers to serve, still lessons to be passed down. And so, he continued his duties in the mess hall, as quietly and humbly as he had always done. One evening, after another long day of serving meals, Martin was walking back to his quarters when he noticed a familiar face waiting for him. Outside his door, it was Lieutenant Harris, the young officer who had first spoken to him months ago, the one who had asked about his story and had been the first to truly listen. "Sir," the lieutenant said, his voice filled with a mix of respect and uncertainty. "I wanted to thank you for everything, for sharing your story, for your service. You've changed the way I see this life." Martin paused, looking at the young man who had once been just another soldier among many. But now, there was something different about him, a newfound respect, a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to be a part of the military. "It's not just me, Lieutenant," Martin replied quietly. "It's all of us. The ones who came before us, the ones who gave their lives. We all carry that legacy with us. It's not about medals or recognition. It's about doing what's right, no matter the cost." The lieutenant nodded, his gaze steady. "I understand, sir. I never really understood it before. But now, I see what you meant. It's not about the glory. It's about the duty. And it's about honoring the men who came before us." Martin smiled slightly, a flicker of pride in his heart. "You're starting to get it," he said. "That's the first step." The lieutenant stood there for a moment, looking as if he had more to say, but couldn't quite find the words. Finally, he spoke again. "If there's anything I can do to help, anything at all, just let me know. I want to carry this legacy forward. I want to do right by those who came before me." Martin studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "You're already doing it, Lieutenant. Just by understanding. That's all we can ask of anyone." With that, the lieutenant gave a quick salute before walking away, leaving Martin standing in the quiet evening. As he watched the young officer disappear into the night, Martin felt a sense of peace settle over him. The future was in good hands. The lessons of the past were being carried forward, and the sacrifices of those who had served in the shadows were not forgotten. And as long as soldiers like Lieutenant Harris continued to serve with honor and respect, the legacy of the Ghost Squadron, and all those who had come before, would never fade. The next few weeks passed in relative peace, and though Martin never sought out attention, he could feel the shift in the base. It wasn't just that people respected him now. It was that they understood what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to honor the past. The old veterans who had once been pushed aside, their stories left untold, were now being heard. Their experiences were being shared, their lessons being passed down to the next generation. It was a quiet revolution, one that didn't make headlines or create a stir in the media, but it was the kind of revolution that mattered. It was a revolution of respect, of remembrance, and of duty. One evening, as the sun set behind the base, Martin found himself walking alone along the quiet path that led to the edge of the camp. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with the colors of dusk. He walked slowly, his hands tucked into his jacket, his thoughts far away. He thought of his time in the Ghost Squadron, the battles they had fought, the men and women he had lost. But he also thought of the soldiers who had followed in his footsteps, the ones who had taken up the mantle of service and had come to understand what it meant to be part of something greater than themselves. As he reached the edge of the base, Martin stopped and looked out over the horizon. The world had changed since his time in the service, but some things remained the same. The sacrifices made by soldiers, the honor of duty, the bonds forged in the heat of battle, those things had not changed, and they never would. Martin Kelly knew that, no matter what came next, he had fulfilled his duty. And as long as the stories of the men and women who had served with him were remembered, he could rest easy, knowing that their sacrifices had not been in vain. The months rolled on, and the base had truly changed. The shift in culture was palpable. It wasn't something that could be pointed to directly, but anyone who had been there before could feel it. Soldiers walked with their heads held a little higher, their conversations a little quieter, their respect for their peers and their history growing with each passing day. Martin Kelly, however, had not changed. His place in the mess hall remained the same. He still served the same meals, still cleaned the same counters, and still greeted soldiers with the same quiet, unassuming demeanor. But something had shifted in him. The weight of the legacy he had carried for so long, the weight of those forgotten years, now felt lighter. It wasn't that he had sought the recognition. It wasn't even about the ceremony or the documentary or the speeches. It was about the acknowledgement, the understanding that his story and the story of the men he served with would not be forgotten. It was about knowing that future generations of soldiers would understand what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to honor the past. One evening, Martin sat in his small room on base, a cup of coffee in front of him. The light outside was fading, and the sounds of the base were quieter than usual. His thoughts wandered to the years he had spent serving in the Ghost Squadron, to the missions that had never been talked about, to the faces of the men who had died and whose names would never be known. They had all made sacrifices, and for most of them, the world would never know what they had done. But now, Martin knew that their story was being remembered, and that was enough. As he sat there, lost in thought, there was a knock at his door. It was Lieutenant Harris, the young officer who had once approached him in the mess hall, unsure of who he was. But that had been months ago. Now, Harris had become a regular presence in Martin's life, and over time, the two had formed an unlikely bond. Martin had taught him much about service, about duty, about what it truly meant to wear the uniform. And Harris had taught Martin that there was a new generation of soldiers who understood, who would carry the lessons forward. "Sergeant Major," Harris said, his voice respectful as he entered the room. "I wanted to talk to you about something." Martin gestured for him to sit. "What's on your mind, Lieutenant?" Harris hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said during the memorial, about how we honor the sacrifices of those who came before us. And, well, there's something I want to do. Something to make sure your story, and the story of the Ghost Squadron, doesn't get lost." Martin raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" Harris looked down for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I've been talking to some of the other officers, and we're thinking about creating a permanent memorial here on the base. Something that honors not just you, but the entire Ghost Squadron. A place where soldiers can go and learn about your legacy, about the sacrifices made, about the men who fought and died in secret, never asking for anything in return." Martin sat back in his chair, his hands resting on the table in front of him. The idea of a memorial, a permanent tribute to the Ghost Squadron, was something he hadn't considered. He'd always thought that honoring the past was a quiet thing, done in the hearts of those who remembered, not something displayed for the world to see. But the more he thought about it, the more the idea made sense. The sacrifices of his brothers and sisters had never been for recognition. But if this memorial could ensure that their story was never forgotten, that future generations could learn from it, then perhaps it was worth it. "I think it's a good idea," Martin said, his voice steady. "But it's not just about me or the Ghost Squadron. It's about all the soldiers who serve, who sacrifice, and who go unnoticed. They're the ones who deserve the most recognition. The ones who do the work every day, without asking for anything in return." Harris nodded, understanding. "I know, Sergeant Major. This memorial will be for them, too. For everyone who served, who gave everything, and who did it without ever seeking glory." Martin looked at him for a long moment. "If you're going to do this, make sure it's done right. Make sure the stories of the men who never made it back are told. They're the ones who deserve this more than anyone else." Harris stood, his expression resolute. "I promise, sir. We'll make sure their story is heard. We'll make sure no one ever forgets." Martin watched as the lieutenant left his room, the weight of the past still with him. But now, for the first time in years, it felt like the weight of something important being acknowledged. The memorial was only the beginning. It would serve as a reminder of what it meant. To serve with honor, to give without expectation, and to never let the past fade into obscurity. Martin Kelly had lived a life filled with sacrifices, but now, his story, and the story of his brothers in arms, would live on, not just in the quiet corners of memory, but in the hearts of every soldier who came after them. The plans for the memorial were moving forward at a steady pace, and with each passing day, the project began to take on a life of its own. The soldiers, officers, and veterans who had been touched by Martin Kelly's story rallied around the idea, eager to honor the sacrifices of the Ghost Squadron and all those who had served in silence. The project grew beyond just a simple monument. It became a symbol, a place where the legacy of the past could live on, reminding future generations of the true meaning of service and sacrifice. Martin had given his blessing to the memorial, but as the plans were finalized, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. The stories, the memories, the lessons, they all needed to be captured in a way that went beyond just a plaque or a statue. The memorial would be a powerful tribute, but Martin knew that the essence of the Ghost Squadron and the spirit of those who had served needed to be preserved in a more personal way. One evening, as Martin sat in his room, reflecting on the impact of the memorial, there was another knock on his door. This time, it was Colonel Harris, who had been leading the efforts to bring the memorial to life. The colonel entered, a stack of papers in hand, his expression one of determination and urgency. "Sergeant Major," Harris began, "I've been thinking a lot about the memorial. We've got the physical part nailed down, the statue, the plaque, the location. But I think we need something more. Something that will truly capture the spirit of the Ghost Squadron and the men who served with you." Martin looked up, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" Harris placed the papers on the table and slid them toward Martin. "A collection of stories, Sergeant Major. We've got some of the surviving members of the squadron who've agreed to help. But we also want to include your perspective, your memories. We want to record the stories of the men who fought alongside you, the missions you undertook, the sacrifices that were made. We're thinking of putting together a book, a permanent record that can be passed down to future generations. It's about more than just the memorial. It's about making sure their stories are never forgotten." Martin stared at the papers for a moment, the weight of what Harris was asking settling on his shoulders. The thought of reliving those memories, of putting his past into words, was daunting. He had never been one to speak of his experiences, not in detail. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how important it was. The stories needed to be told. The world needed to know the truth about the Ghost Squadron, about the men who had given everything without ever seeking glory. "I'll do it," Martin said, his voice steady. "But it won't be just my story. It will be theirs, too. The men who never came back, the ones who sacrificed everything and never got to tell their side. This is for them." Harris nodded, a look of respect in his eyes. "We wouldn't expect anything less, Sergeant Major. You've always put them first." And so, over the next few months, Martin began the difficult process of revisiting the past. Each day, he sat with Colonel Harris and other members of the squadron, recounting the missions, the challenges, and the losses. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of those memories threatened to overwhelm him, but he pressed on. He knew that the stories of his brothers in arms had to be shared. The book took shape slowly, each chapter filled with vivid recollections of covert operations, dangerous encounters, and moments of heroism that had never been acknowledged. The stories of the men of the Ghost Squadron, their bravery in the face of impossible odds, began to emerge from the shadows of history. As the project neared completion, Martin felt a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't known he was missing. The memorial was important, yes, but the book, the collection of stories, was something more. It was a piece of history, a lasting legacy for those who had never been recognized. It was the culmination of years of silence, years of forgotten service, and now, it would be remembered forever. The day the book was published was a quiet one. There was no grand ceremony, no media frenzy, just a simple gathering of the men who had helped bring the project to life. Martin sat at the front of the room, the finished book in front of him, the weight of its significance heavy on his chest. He didn't need applause, didn't need the recognition. The book wasn't for him. It was for the men who had served with him, for the ones who had fallen, and for the generations to come who would learn their story. As the soldiers and veterans flipped through the pages, reading the stories of the Ghost Squadron for the first time, there was a collective silence in the room. The weight of the history contained within those pages was undeniable. It wasn't just a book. It was a testament to the sacrifices made, to the brotherhood forged in the heat of battle, and to the quiet heroes who had never asked for anything but the opportunity to serve. In the years that followed, the memorial became a place of pilgrimage for soldiers and veterans alike. It wasn't just a statue in the center of the base. It was a living memorial, a reminder of the men who had served, fought, and died. And through the book, their story would never be forgotten. Martin Kelly, the quiet man behind the counter, had ensured that their sacrifices would be remembered, not just on a plaque, but in the hearts of every soldier who walked by. He had given them a voice, and through that voice, their legacy would live on forever. Years had passed since the memorial was unveiled, and Martin Kelly had long since retired from the mess hall. The base, once a place where he simply served food and carried on with his daily duties, had now become a place of remembrance. The Ghost Squadron's legacy, once shrouded in secrecy, had been laid bare for the world to see. The memorial stood proudly at the center of the base, a tribute not just to Martin and his comrades, but to every soldier who had given their life in service without expecting recognition. Every soldier who passed through the base now made a point of visiting the memorial, standing before the statue of the Ghost Squadron's emblem, reflecting on the history that had shaped their own service. Martin knew that the legacy of those men would continue to live on long after he was gone. His place in history was secure, not through accolades, but through the simple act of ensuring their story was heard. But Martin never felt comfortable with the idea of being remembered as a hero. To him, the real heroes were those who had made the ultimate sacrifice, those who had given everything and never had the chance to share their stories. For years, he had carried the weight of their memory, but now, their voices were being heard. The men of the Ghost Squadron were no longer forgotten. They had been immortalized, not just in stone, but in the hearts of the soldiers who followed in their footsteps. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Martin sat on a bench near the memorial, his old body creaking as he shifted. He hadn't come to the base much since his retirement, but today, he felt the need to visit. It was a quiet day, the kind where the base felt still, like it was holding its breath. He looked up at the statue, the weathered stone etched with the insignia of the Ghost Squadron. He remembered the men, their faces long since faded from memory, but their sacrifices still fresh in his mind. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and Martin turned to see Lieutenant Harris walking toward him. Harris had been a young officer when he first met Martin, but now, he had risen through the ranks. He had become a leader in his own right, someone who carried the lessons of Martin and the Ghost Squadron with him every day. "Sergeant Major," Harris said, his voice filled with respect. "I've been meaning to come by. I wanted to thank you, again, for everything, for teaching me what it really means to serve." Martin smiled softly, his old eyes crinkling at the edges. "You've learned the most important lesson, Lieutenant. It's not about glory. It's about the people you serve with, and the sacrifices you make for each other." Harris nodded, standing beside him. "I still remember what you said during the memorial," he said, his voice quiet. "You told us to never forget the men who didn't come back. I've made it my mission to make sure their stories live on, to honor them in everything I do." Martin looked at him, pride swelling in his chest. "And that's all I ever asked, Harris. Just don't let them be forgotten. You're doing good work." The two men stood in silence for a moment, their thoughts drifting back to the past. Martin thought of the battles they fought, the missions that never made it into the history books, and the comrades who would never return. But he also thought of the future, of the soldiers who would continue the fight, who would carry the torch long after he was gone. "The men who served with me," Martin said, his voice firm, "they did it because it was the right thing to do. Not for recognition, not for medals. They did it because they knew that their service meant something bigger than themselves." Harris nodded, his eyes reflecting the weight of Martin's words. "And because of you, Sergeant Major, their story will never be lost. We'll make sure of it." Martin looked up at the memorial again, the sunlight casting long shadows over the base. It had been a long time since he'd thought about the past so deeply, but in that moment, he felt at peace. The men he had served with would always be remembered, and their sacrifices would never be in vain. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Martin stood, his old joints creaking with the effort. "It's time for me to go," he said quietly. "I've done what I needed to do. The rest is up to you, Harris." The young officer gave a solemn nod. "We'll keep their legacy alive, Sergeant Major. I promise." Martin smiled one last time, then turned and slowly walked away, leaving the memorial behind. He knew that as long as soldiers like Harris carried the lessons forward, the memory of the Ghost Squadron and the sacrifice of all who served would never fade. As Martin left the base that day, he knew he had done what was needed. He had ensured that the story of the Ghost Squadron would never be lost, that their memory would live on in every soldier who passed through the gates. And that, he knew, was enough. Experience an emotional story that transcends time and speaks to the heart of every soldier who has ever served. This moving tale follows Martin Kelly, a veteran of the Ghost Squadron, as he quietly serves his country, only to later become a symbol of sacrifice and honor. This emotional story takes you through the journey of Martin, from the shadows of secrecy to the public recognition of the sacrifices made by him and his brothers in arms. As the story unfolds, the reader is drawn into a world of unspoken heroism, where courage and sacrifice are quietly honored, and the voices of forgotten soldiers are finally heard. This emotional story highlights the power of remembrance and the deep respect earned through a life of service. Join Martin as he navigates the quiet moments of his life, the stirring recognition, and the final act of sharing his legacy. It's a tribute to all those who serve with unwavering dedication, and a reminder that every emotional story is worth telling. Don't miss this deeply moving journey that captures the essence of sacrifice, brotherhood, and honor in its truest form.